at the time, both of those cities were in free states. And so they actually had legislation on the books that said that, hey, slave owners, if you dock even in a ship on our ports with your enslaved people, they are freed by the laws of this state.
Run, Mary, run, run, Martha, run, Mary, run, I say. You've got a right to the tree of life. You've got a right to the tree of life, yeah.
Hello, Khalil. My name is Dr. Nikki Taylor, but let's start with you introducing yourself. I know all about you because I'm a follower of yours on TikTok, but for the audience that is not up on things, why don't you introduce yourself?
So hi to you, Dr. Taylor, or Nikki, as you gave me
Yeah.
permission to call you, just for anyone out there, not disrespecting. But hi, how are you? How is everyone? My name is Khalil Green. I am a 23-year-old public historian on social media mainly, but also other platforms like media and TV. I'm from Germantown, Maryland, which has actually been ranked as the most diverse place in the United States in the past. And I recently graduated from Yale University, where I got a degree in history, specifically the history of social change and social movements. So looking at protests mainly in the late 1900s, and where I also served as the school's first Black student body president. And upon graduation, I became a full-time content creator where I make videos about hidden history, specifically on social media. So I'm so excited to be here today with you, Nikki, to talk about some primary source documents revolving around the case of J.H. Wheeler, of Jane Johnson, who was an enslaved Black woman that found her freedom upon one trip to the North, her freedom along with the freedom of her two sons. So I just want to jump into this story and get your perspective on what drew you to this story, to these documents, and to talking about this topic.
Okay, before we do that, let me briefly introduce myself. I'm Nikki Taylor, and I am a professor of history at Howard University, the capstone of Black education. And for the past 7 years, I served as a chair, but I'm recently freed up to do my research. I'm an author of 4 books, all of them about Black protest and resistance in the age of slavery. And as I move on in my career, I'm finding, Khalil, that my books are getting more and more radical. The last one, entitled Brooding Over Bloody Revenge, was about enslaved women who use lethal force against their owners. So that's where I am for the audience, but I'm a specialist in 19th century. And so your question was, if you could repeat it for the audience. Okay.
First, I want to ask you, Nikki, what drew you to this specific case of Jane Johnson and her finding her freedom alongside her two sons?
Well, because I focus on enslaved women and their radical actions to protest slavery, I always look for sources that center Black women's voices. And we might assume that there are a lot of sources like that, Khalil, but you know, having been a history major, that there are very few in the age of slavery, especially that have, or, you know, Black women speaking out in thundertones about how they felt, their critiques of slavery. So this case, although it's at the Library of Congress on the website, if any of you are interested. So although this case is filed under the name of the white abolitionist Passmore Williamson, in how I read it, reading against the grain, it's absolutely about the Underground Railroad and Jane Johnson. And so that's the reason I chose this case. And I was hoping that, you know, it will resonate with you. What did you think when you read it?
Well, I can definitely say it did resonate. I found that there's almost this interesting narrative arc where when we're first introduced to Jane Johnson with the New York Tribune, there's a lot of the account gives voice to Wheeler, who was her enslaver. And upon like first meeting her and going through the narrative of how they were able to specifically Passmore Williamson and Mr. Still, if I have it correct, were able to liberate her. You hear like Wheeler say that she wants to be with him, that she's happy to be there, and you hear like this white enslaver be the voice almost of Jane Johnson.
Yeah.
And I mean, it's not necessarily like a narrative, it's not fiction in any way, but to see over like throughout the reading of the primary source document, as you get more into the case and as you specifically end alongside Jane Johnson's own testimony, where you can hear her voice and the steps that she took towards her freedom and her constant assertion that she wanted to be free, that like the voice of Mr. Wheeler, of sorry, J.H. Wheeler
Yeah.
specifically, was not her voice. I just loved like that arc,
Oh,
that
yeah.
reading that. It was very empowering.
So maybe we should let our audience know what this case is about. Khalil, do you want me to do the overview or do you want to do it?
I would love for you to start and then I'll try to add, I mean, because you probably have the most comprehensive, and then I'll add in anything that I notice or that could bring in my own perspective in some ways.
Okay, this case is in 1855, and it's in the tumultuous decades of the 1850s. Like each year of the 1850s, there was a deeper and deeper chasm between North and South. So Jane Johnson was enslaved to a man, very powerful man, right? John Wheeler, who was recently elected minister to Nicaragua.
Mhm.
So he had purchased her 2 years previously from somebody in Richmond, and she was with him in DC. So when he was appointed as the minister of Nicaragua, he decides, Khalil, again, audience, against all common sense, that he would try, but it's almost about whiteness and power and arrogance. He decided he would take her through by ship through Philadelphia and New York City. At the time, both of those cities were in free states. And so not only were they in free states that no longer had slavery, but they actually had legislation on the books that said that, hey, slave owners, if you dock even in a ship on our ports with your enslaved people, they are freed by the laws of this state. So it was just really some of the best legislation, in my opinion, in the antebellum era. So he brings her to Philadelphia, and Jane Johnson reveals in her testimony that she always wanted to be free, and that she had overheard her owner talking about his ambivalence about taking her to New York and Philadelphia, and she determined she would set her sights on freedom. And so she took with her a suit of clothes, because people understood that the clothing was how people would identify, a fugitive or, an enslaved person who was self-emancipating. And so she took that suit of clothes and determined that she would reach out to Black people, any Black person she saw, to try to solicit help. So when they got to Philadelphia, her owner had her under lock and key. He was pretty much stalking her every move. He watched her like a hawk, and she could barely get a breath of air without him watching her. And he actually had given her a script. He basically told her to tell people she was a free woman traveling with him, to accompany a minister. And so she basically understood that, okay, this guy is doing the most, as your generation says. So when she got to Philadelphia, she tried to contact different Blacks, different African Americans living and working on the docks of Philadelphia. One of them wrote a letter and gave it to William Still, who's arguably one of the best and most effective Underground Railroad conductors, bar none. He was operating in Philadelphia, and historians have estimated that he personally led to freedom either 649 to 800 enslaved people. So he was very effective. But even still, as a Black man, he understood that he had to get some white assistance. So he went to the office of Passmore Williamson, who was a white abolitionist who also was involved in Underground Railroad activities. So they both went to the docks to, see what was going on. They got on the ship. They see Jane Johnson and started asking her certain things. If you want to read that, Khalil.
Okay, so I'm gonna start with the testimony specifically coming from Still, who was the man who was working with Pastor Williams to liberate Jane Johnson and her two sons. So he says, first he arrives on the boat and he sees that she's not there on the first deck. Another unknown voice, he says, utters that they're on the second deck. And they go up, they approach Jane Johnson, who at the time is anxious looking, according to the testimony, and they ask her, the first words are you traveling? She says, yes. Then they ask her, with whom? She nods her head towards Wheeler, and she's fidgeting. And then he says, do they belong to you, sir? To Wheeler. And then Wheeler says, yes, they're in my charge. And then turning from Wheeler to the mother, being Jane Johnson, they ask specifically to her, or they inform of her rights, specifically saying, you are entitled to your freedom according to the laws of Pennsylvania, having been brought into this state by your owner. And if you prefer freedom to slavery, as we suppose everyone else does, you have the chance to accept it now. And at this point, it's interesting because you start to see commotion, not just between these two and Jane Johnson and Wheeler, but other people who are also on the ship get involved as like bystanders. So there's a man who actually supports, let me see if I can find it here, but there's like a man who supports Wheeler who says it's his property, like leave it alone. And then there's other people on the ship who are just like viewing, and one elderly white gentleman, they say specifically, seems to take a lot of interest and sympathize specifically with Jane Johnson. So there's a commotion that happens. It's not just a very clean operation. It's almost like cinematic in a way. And I thought that was really interesting about what happened.
Yeah, and then like it was just so powerful how that community coalesced around her. And William Still says he grabbed one arm, Passmore Williamson the other, and there were a string of Black men who helped carry the kids or two children who were traveling with her. And it was just beautiful. There was a carriage waiting on the docks, and she got carried away by the Underground Railroad. But the thing is, all of the Black men who assisted were arrested, right? They were arrested for crimes like highway robbery, which the DA decided not to pursue that. They were charged with riot and assault and battery, like because Wheeler was trying to pretend he had been beat up and they stole her, and this was not her free will. And even another thing that historians only recently, like the last 20 years, have their main intervention into the history of the Underground Railroad is centering Black conductors like William Still, and then the activism or the self-respect of the enslaved people who stated in no uncertain terms, like Jane Johnson did, I want my freedom. And she even said, I'd rather die than go back to slavery. And that challenges this idea that being a house slave, so to speak, was better. We have that assumption in our community that being a house slave was somehow easier or better. But in fact, all of these people, and these women in particular who worked in the house, she said, I'd rather die than go back. So that gives you an idea that this was really horrific and traumatizing for them to be in bondage, even in the house. What do you think of that?
So I agree. I think that there's the sort of binary that's come up in common discourse around like the house slave or the field slave. There's also some sort of colorism commentary or shorthand that's applied to
Exactly.
that, and saying that like light-skinned people were usually the house slaves and treated better.
Right.
And alternatively, darker skinned people were the field slaves. I think a lot of that can come down to sort of folklore almost, or just
Very ahistorical and not at all what actually happened. You're absolutely right.
yeah. And I think that that's like the best way of just approaching it, just saying it's ahistorical. But I think there's almost commentary to pull from the fact that that is how it's remembered.
Mhm.
And I think that it goes back to what you're saying, or what we were talking about before, in that slavery has been downplayed at such an intense level, that even though people are in subjugation, which is just fundamentally not something that'll ever sit right with any human, there's the idea that if it's like there's tiers to it. So if you're like in the higher tier and you're doing domestic labor, you're still like you're gonna be fine, like it's not as bad. But I think it just shows that even outside of like the discourse of human rights in terms of how it's been codified in like the 19th century or the 20th century, especially after like World War II or what have you, that there's always like this fundamental sense of human rights that is in every person. And I think that when that's something that people feel discontent towards and how they're treated and how their human rights are being how their human rights are being respected, that they'll act out against and they don't want to be there. So I think it's a testimony to that
Yeah,
theme.
beautifully stated. And so the reasons this case are important, Khalil, for all the reasons that we just said, the centering of a Black voice. I think in addition, her appearance in the courts mattered,
Mhm.
right? I mean, do you ever recall a time where you read about an enslaved person testifying on behalf of a white man that was being murdered by the system? Have you ever heard of such a case?
I have not. I think the closest thing I've heard of is, which we'll go into later, is, for
Mhm,
example, Dred Scott or enslaved people suing for their own freedom. But when it comes to testimonies, I actually recently did last year a
mhm,
whole series in California history, which
mhm.
is on the West Coast. But even there was a law that said that you cannot testify if you're a Black person in any case.
Right.
And there was one man who appeared white, but they examined his whole body and found one curly hair. And
Oh my
from that curly
gosh.
hair, they distinguished him as a person of the Black race and took out his testimony. So like
Oh
that
my
that
gosh.
specific thing around courts and the judicial process and the testimony of enslaved Black people in general is it's a very rare thing. So I think it's very
Yeah.
interesting in this case.
That's very captivating, that case. You'll have to send me more information about it. I was not aware of that case.
Yeah, I have a
But
TikTok and I'll send you.
yeah, it's very intriguing. But I think that, yeah, most people assume that because Black people were born in America, slave or free, that they were considered citizens. But the citizenship issue started to kind of peek through in this issue. They did allow her to testify in court. And what was interesting is that even William Still said he had never seen anything like it. I think he said, let me find this exact word.
Mhm.
He said that it was an indescribable feeling that he felt, like in terms of pride, to see her stand up in court and testify that nobody led me away to freedom. Nobody kidnapped me into freedom. Nobody forced me. I wanted my freedom. So that was just, they hadn't seen that before. And they were just shocked. The Black community specifically, and shocked and very proud that she stood up in a court to give her testimony. In addition to that, I think what was really interesting is this backdrop, the scene. And I don't know if you caught it because they didn't really focus on it that much, but she had violated, according to Wheeler, the Fugitive Slave Act of 1850.
Mhm.
And so she, had violated that, and all of the people who assisted her had also violated that act, according to Wheeler. But the state officials in Pennsylvania came in force, because what happened, what the Wheeler and his people thought, they would quickly ferret her away and she'd disappear and back into slavery somewhere where we would never have seen her again. But in addition to the federal officials being there, the federal marshals intending to take her into custody, the state officials were there to protect her freedom. So you have on one side the federal officials, on the other side the state officials, and they both were there to do different things with Jane Johnson. But in the end, it's the state officials that won. Her freedom was protected. She was able to exit the courthouse and live her life as a free woman. And so it really shows like the difference between the federal laws and the state and how they were butting heads when it came to enforcement of the Fugitive Slave Act in the North.
Yeah, it was almost like a mini civil war in a way. That's a crazy thing
Exactly.
to say, but and even reading it, like there was at least like I believe this is the Tribune recounting it, but it says that it was almost as if nothing could avert a bloody scene,
Yeah.
specifically about like these states, people from the state and a federal side, and I thought that was like a really interesting metaphorical, but at the same time, almost like even literal precursor to the events of the Civil War and like how the defense of the institution of slavery, of these like laws that were meant to protect slave owners and the sort of the view that they're unjust or that they shouldn't be as enforced as they are, whatever the case might be, or that they're just generally misapplied in certain cases, really is a pretense to what would happen at a national level. So I thought that was like also a really interesting way of viewing this specific instance at the end of the narrative.
Oh yeah, I also was touched by that, the imagery of those sides pitted against one another. So, and I think you're right, it did foretell of what would happen just 6 years later. I mean, this is just 6 years later, the country was in a bloody civil war. So, yeah.
So from your perspective, what has been when you came into, let's say, the study of history, the landscape around the Underground Railroad in terms of almost a place and a haven for like white saviors and Quakers
Hmm. Oh
versus
yeah.
the work that you've done to really add in the Black narratives, not only of Black people who were part of the Underground Railroad and helping others get freedom, but also the Black enslaved people, specifically like Jane Johnson, who coordinated and strategized and took measures to ensure their own freedom, their own liberation.
Yeah, I think Larry Guerra, this a scholar named Larry Guerra, was among the first to try to center Black conductors, people like William Sill, and others came along after him. But I think beforehand, yes, this idea of a white savior dominated the discourse of the Underground Railroad. And in fact, Khalil, I'm sure there are lots of corners in America where this is being taught, at the college level, even where this still is the case, where people are focusing mostly on people like Levi Coffin and Passmore Williamson and others. So it's very important to write a truer history that includes and doesn't just discount the activism of enslaved people, freedom seekers, but also the activism of the actual abolitionist activists, free Blacks and enslaved people were some of the strongest abolitionists. I mean, they had a desire for freedom that was almost palpable. And so, to discount their experiences is to do a disservice to the history of the Underground Railroad. There are many things we wouldn't understand. For example, the fact that Jane Johnson, her instinct, Khalil, was to trust Black people. So
Mhm.
that's why she kept talking to different Black people and trying to get their attention. But when she was trying to get word that she needed help. And so that was her instinct. So you needed Black people to be the first frontier of freedom, so to speak. And so many of them were. And then because they were not treated as citizens in many places in the North, then they were obligated at times to seek assistance from white people who were better shielded from laws and from illegal search and seizures and things like that. So they understood that. They understood that they could only hide or help the fugitive only so long. And if it was a big case, they definitely needed the assistance of people like Passmore Williamson and others. And so I think so you tell a richer history when you talk about it in this way. And you also see a lot more interracial collaboration, which, previously, prior to Larry Guerra, we wouldn't have even considered such a thing to be, normal or, like, and so in my opinion, the Underground Railroad was, one of the most significant social movements in American history. And it's one of the few times where Blacks and whites of all classes helped each other and helped enslaved people seek their freedom. So I think it's a very special era, and it's because of the Underground Railroad and the abolitionist movement and Black people's roles in that, that I decided to specialize in 19th century history. I mean, I'm in love with that moment where that was possible. Other than the civil rights movement of the 20th century, that was just such a beautiful cooperative moment. And so that's why this needs to be told and retold in this more inclusive way.
Yeah, and you mentioned like there's a level of interracial collaboration that you wouldn't have known otherwise. And I found that in this case, though I might be extrapolating a little bit, it seems like there's also a level of intergenerational collaboration when Still begins his like I guess, or this is from the New York Tribune, but I think it's from his perspective. Basically, he says that it was a colored boy who he's never seen before, that was able to hand him the note, right? And then
That's
when he got
right.
onto the ship, he says, I think that boy, he recognized that boy there. And I don't know exactly what boy means a specific age range during that time, but it seems like there's a level of young people and also like older males, and Jane Johnson herself, and just a sort of like community collaboration and effort that doesn't necessarily preclude people who are not full adults from participating in this liberation movement.
You know what? That was genius. I've never thought about that, Khalil.
Oh, wow. Thanks, thanks.
I have never even considered that, but you're absolutely right. I'm just thinking about other cases and I'm like, yeah, they're there and they're participating, and you're absolutely right. Somebody needs to do that book on intergenerational assistance on the Underground Railroad.
Yeah, one day, one day. I mean,
Yeah.
the reason I think of that is because fast forward, what, 200 plus years, a lot of young Gen Zers right now are really leading a lot of conversations. And I think almost in every era, specifically, like let's say like since Jim Crow, it's really been young people who have also tried to champion causes, even as young as I forgot which city, but they had like the huge school what's called walkouts during the
Oh,
civil
yeah.
rights movement. And they had like young people just like like literally leaving young as like elementary school. So it's always, especially in today's time, an interesting viewpoint to see how young people were a part of different movements throughout history.
I agree, especially during the civil rights movement. But let me ask you this: why do you think that is? Why is it that the youth are the salvation for every era? Like it just every social movement, definitely. And now I have to add this, Underground Railroad, which I had never thought of, but every 20th century social movement for sure, like relied on youth activism, some as young as 10, 9, 8 years old. Why do you think that is? Why are young people more inclined to participate in these sorts of things?
Yeah, I would say if I had to pick two or three things off the top of my head, I mean, one is we're less entrenched in the way things are, which I think we have, what allows us to have more of a vision on the way things should be, and more of a fervor to enact that. So, for example, in the professional world, it's a growing conversation that Gen Zers don't just have one job, and that we're constantly looking for a place that allows us to protect our mental health, but also be involved in social activism if we want to do that and not have the risk of us losing our employment. And I think for older generations who have been in the workplace and have seen it operate in one way for so long, they're less inclined to make those demands or even believe that something like that is possible or envision how it could play out. So I think that imaginative world view is a lot easier when you have maybe a little bit less life experience, which almost sounds ironic, but that's
Yeah.
definitely a big part of it.
Yeah, I think we get, if I look at even myself, you get more resigned to accept certain things as you get older and you have more to lose, like your
Yeah.
house, your job, your car. And I think it kind of puts concrete on our feet. And I tell my students that it's up to them, right? That like you have unbounded freedom and the ability to be able to lead these things. So we kind of need the youth in ways that I don't think many of you all understand. We absolutely need you to be out here leading these charges. And I'm just, lifted when I see people like you and your TikTok channel doing just that. It just warms my heart because so many of the people in my age group are just resigned to, we've already been successful in this system, so we can't imagine a reordering of the system in any way. So absolutely, I agree with you.
Yeah, and I think that something you said would have led to my second point, specifically in that there is a little bit less for us to lose.
Mhm.
Even in this case, you see that the criminal justice system, quote unquote, is being enacted upon like a white male,
Yeah.
with Asmer Williams.
And the black men, don't forget them.
Yeah, so I was
Yeah.
gonna say that like if it's being enacted on a white male, then we know for the black people, the high level of intersections that you have, whether it be a black woman, black male who's in poverty or enslaved, whatever the case is, it's gonna be that much worse. So then when you
Exactly.
add in like someone who has a family to take care of or whatever risks is in their life, it's gonna make them, it's gonna be more of a deterrent. And I think that maybe for young people, there's a little bit less to lose or a lot less to lose in some cases. So we're able to take those risks that people who have more responsibility may not be able to risk in their own life.
Yeah, absolutely.
Run, Mary, run. Run, Martha, run. Run, Mary, run. I say, you've got a right to the tree of life. You've got a right to the tree of life, yeah. Run, Mary, run. Run, Martha, run. Run, Mary, run. I say, you've got a right to the tree of life. You've got a right to the tree of life, yeah. Run, Mary, run. Run, Martha, run. Run, Mary, run. I say, you've got a right to the tree of life. You've got a right to the tree of life, yeah.